Hello, and welcome back to Dr. Vaughn's Philosophy 101 online lectures. This is the historical context of the modern period, the Renaissance, and the rise of skepticism. Don't forget, the transcript for this series is available for download on the notes page of my website. This is Part 4, the Theological Revolution. As if the astronomical and geographical revolutions that we've already talked about weren't enough to cause the rise of skepticism in Europe during the Renaissance, the theological revolution would certainly drive the point home. Now, there had always been differences in liturgy and dogma amongst Christians in Europe, but there had been a long, slow trend toward unity in the Latin Church. Sure, there were occasional heretical sects that would flare up now and again, but the Church had always found ways of overcoming these irregularities and bringing about consensus, either through persuasion or, in some cases, force. But the Renaissance would bring all that hard-won unity finally crashing down. The Theological Revolution would first bring about a fragmentation of the Church, followed by a radicalization of dogma and doctrine and religious differences, which would end in religious nationalization and ideological conflicts that would lead to the persecution and death of untold numbers of people. The seemingly unbreachable unity of medieval Christianity, which had survived the collapse of the Roman Empire, would come to an agonizing end, all because somebody sent a memo. The date was All Hallows' Eve, in the year of our Lord, as it was called back then, 1517. The place was a small backwater town of Wittenberg in the Saxony of Anhalt on the Elbe River. A local parish priest and recent graduate of the new University of Wittenberg by the name of Martin Luther needed to send an urgent message to his boss, Albert. It seemed that attendance at Mass had dramatically fallen off of late, and Father Martin had a good idea as to the cause. But as the email servers were all offline, due to not having yet been invented, he'd just have to write a memo and tack it up on his boss's door. The problem, according to Father Martin, was complex. First of all, church was boring. The entire liturgy was not only in a foreign language, Latin, it was in a dead foreign language. After all, the Roman Empire had been gone for 1,000 years, but the church insisted on keeping the ancient language of the empire, perhaps to add to the mystery of the Mass. But for whatever reason, most people had no idea what was going on in church. You just waited for the man in the vestments to ring a bell and call you down for some bread and wine. You might get a brief homily in your native language, but that was about it. The solution, thought Luther, was to translate the liturgy in the Bible into the vernacular language of the people so they could be more engaged in the Mass. Another problem, from Luther's point of view, was the frightening rise of superstition and magical thinking on the part of the common people. It started with the Crusaders of the High Middle Ages bringing back souvenirs from their pilgrimages to the Holy Land, picked up in the local markets of Jerusalem or Antioch. Things like a splinter of the True Cross or a finger bone of St. Denis the Obscure, which were thought to have curative powers both for the body and soul. Out-and-out rivalries had begun to develop between cities to attract tourists to see their collections of relics, like a slat from the manger or the molar of St. Paul's second cousin. And it helped if you had a local saint who had performed miracles before he or she died, and the bigger the miracle, the bigger the draw, because people would travel hundreds, if not thousands of miles to venerate a powerful saint and receive a blessing from the excess grace thought to exist in this religious bric-a-brac. But if you could earn God's grace by going on a pilgrimage to the shrine of Saint whomever, as well as have a nice holiday along the way, well, why bother staying home and going to the local boring church to hear the local priest drone on in a dead language that often he didn't even understand? The whole business of venerating relics and saints was, according to Luther, getting completely out of hand. But Luther's biggest peeve was with the practice of selling papal indulgences. A representative of the Vatican named Johann Tetzel had arrived in town just a year earlier with a mobile printing press, the Renaissance equivalents of the internet, and with a franchise from Pope Leo X himself to exchange forgiveness for coin. He'd even created an ad campaign. When a coin in the coffer rings, he would say, "A soul from Purgatory Springs." The idea was that one could buy short-term indulgences for minor sins as an act of piety, and that would cancel out the sin. It was an early adaptation of market economics to religion. You could purchase one of these get-out-of-purgatory free cards for yourself or for a friend, perhaps as an inducement for a naughty tryst. You could hand them out at keggers. You could even buy an indulgence for a dead relative. Now, this may all seem a bit bizarre in hindsight, but it was the logical conclusion to a practice that had started earlier in the Middle Ages. When Pope Urban II first promoted the idea of a crusade to free the Holy Lands from Muslim influence in the 11th century, there wasn't a great deal of excitement about his plan. After all, what's to motivate a soldier to go on a holy war when half the fun of fighting is the raping, pillaging, and plundering to be done before and after the fight? A holy war is sure to be just as boring as going to church. Not exactly the sort of thing to entice the unprofessional warriors of the day. But what's worse, if you were to get yourself killed on one of these holy wars, you might end up in hell, precisely because of all the raping, pillaging, and plundering you were bound to end up doing no matter how pious you tried to be. Heck, just the idea of killing your enemies, as opposed to loving, forgiving, and praying for them, as Jesus had commanded his followers to do, seemed prima facie problematic. Urban's solution was the plenary indulgence, forgiveness in advance of all sins that might be committed while on the crusade. The act of fighting itself would be considered a pious act on behalf of the church, which, after all, was Jesus' representative on earth. So, killing for the church was killing for Jesus, and that seemed logical to a medieval mind anyway. So off they went, having a splendid good time killing each other in the name of God, with an assurance of a golden ticket to heaven if they should happen to be one of the casualties along the way. Now, fast forward a bit, and later church officials were exchanging indulgences for contributions to the building campaigns for the new Gothic cathedrals sprouting up all over Europe. They were immensely expensive, and raising sufficient funds to keep these building projects going, often for multiple generations, required the ongoing and generous support of the European aristocracy. Giving was seen as an act of piety, so exchanging money for absolution seemed like a logical incentive to achieve the church's ends, in this case, the building of cathedrals. Fast forward again, and we arrive at Luther's day, where Pope Leo X, Giovanni de' Medici of the famous Medici clan, was busy with a construction project of his own. He was continuing the construction of St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, begun under his predecessor, Julius II, known as the Warrior Pope. And he was paying an interior decorator named Michelangelo Simeoni to tart the place up a bit. Again, it was all very expensive, and indulgences were the key to financing the whole project. But the Renaissance popes had learned the earlier lessons of the incentives, and this time they were applying them on a market-wide scale. By selling indulgence franchises, the Pope could open new markets among the common people, making up in volume what they might lose in value. Hence, franchised indulgence sales became the penny stock of the day, and the result can still be admired in Vatican City to this very day. If Wittenberg was previously a backwater in Christendom, and if no one had ever heard of Father Martin before now, that was all about to change. The Pope sent a letter to the Holy Roman Emperor telling him to get this nonsense under control tout de suite, so he, in turn, called a royal diet in the city of Worms in 1521. Luther was subpoenaed to testify on behalf of himself and his revolutionary ideas before the emperor, as well as a panel of leading theologians who had been shipped in from all across Europe as expert judges to put this upstart back in his place. However, after several days, it was clear that Father Martin was no ordinary parish priest, and he had thought his ideas through rather carefully. And since they were unable to pin him down on any clear violation of canon law, he was thanked for his input and told to go home and await the Pope's final decision. In the meantime, it had been decided in secret that it would be far easier just to get rid of Luther altogether. After all, the forests of Germany were notoriously full of wolves eating little girls in red cloaks, so surely they could take care of one pesky parish priest. So, if he happened to disappear on his way home, who would be the wiser? But Luther was spared by Frederick III, Elector of Saxony, who kidnapped him before the so-called wolves could get him. He was placed under house arrest in Wartburg Castle, where Frederick and several other German warlords were conspiring to break from Rome. You see, they were tired of sending their tax marks to Italy to pay for the reconstruction of Vatican City, when all that money could be kept at home to build palaces for German lords. The only thing holding them back was the fear of being excommunicated by the Pope. Not because they feared eternal damnation. That was the stuff used to keep the peasants in line. No, the real problem was if they were excommunicated by the Pope, their subjects could easily be manipulated into rising up against them for fear that they too might be excommunicated. These German princes needed a religious diversion for the masses, and in Luther, they found their golden ticket. After a year in captivity, they finally succeeded in convincing Luther that if the Roman Church wouldn't even change that language to adapt to the needs of the people, what hope was there that they would ever listen to him on other matters? The princes of the northern German states, with Luther as their spiritual advisor, broke with Rome. In return, they gave Luther military protection from the Pope and let him create his ideal church based on the principle of sola fide, salvation by faith alone. Lutheranism, the first Protestant church, was born, and the Great Reformation, or more accurately, the Great Fragmentation of Western Christianity, had begun. Thanks to the mobile printing press, made possible by Johannes Gutenberg 60 years earlier, the very tool that spread the abuse of indulgences which had promoted Luther to start making a fuss in the first place, now served as the most efficient tool to spread his ideas across Europe. And although Luther, now known as Dr. Luther as opposed to Father Martin, intended only the best for his community, economic and political unrest that was already afoot began to break out. Luther himself struggled to contain radical revolutionaries in the town of Wittenberg, who were ready to overturn the whole social order, not just the church. But in other places, things were going to get out of control. The Zwickau prophets, Nicholas Storch, Thomas Munzner, and Mark Stubner, spread a message of social reform that went far beyond what Luther had intended. The poor were inflamed, and the Peasants' War would rage from 1524 to 1525. There were other groups who struggled to break free from the hegemony of the Roman Church, most notably the Anabaptists. Their most controversial doctrine was the necessity of adult conversion. Hence, all infant baptism was deemed by them to be invalid. They were thus dubbed the re-baptizers, because you would have to be baptized again as an adult after your conversion. Since they criticized both Catholic and Lutheran alike, they were uniformly despised and persecuted even in territories friendly to Protestantism. But not all the radical theological reformers disrupted civil order. Some, like John Calvin, were theologically radical, while politically very conservative. His Institutes of Christian Religion, published in 1536, went much, much farther in rejecting traditional Catholic theology than Luther had, even challenging traditional notions like free will, which was held by both Lutherans and Catholics. His movement, known now as the Reformed Church, would prove to be the ancestor of most of the popular evangelical Protestant denominations of Europe and North America that we're familiar with today. It would be John Calvin who was actually the ancestor, the progenitor of the evangelical movement, which would of course come to dominate much of Western Christianity. The conclusion to this story of theological revolution, if there is one, concerns how religion came to be identified with politics in a way that would seal the fate of a unified Christian religion forever. Protestantism came to England during the reign of Henry VIII. However, Henry Tudor was no theological malcontent. Far from it. He was as staunch a Catholic as one was likely to find anywhere in Europe, and intellectual enough to go head-to-head with the likes of Martin Luther, which he did in his book, The Defense of the Seven Sacraments, for which he was granted by Pope Leo X the title Fide Defensor, Defender of the Faith. No, it wasn't faith that drove the Reformation in England. It was politics, pure and simple. You see, Henry VIII was only the second in the Tudor dynastic line, which had been established by his father, Henry VII, when the War of the Roses finally came to an end. He would have been the third, but his older brother, Arthur, died at age 15 before he could inherit the throne. Henry was thus promoted early to the role of king, just at the age of 19, when Henry VII, his father, died in 1509. Thus, the Tudor dynasty was shaky at best, as the recent civil war was still fresh in the minds of those who desired power in England. The success of the royal dynasty lay, Henry believed, in the production of a male heir to take power after him. Without a male heir, the country might well be plunged back into chaos. A War of the Roses Part 2. In order to stabilize his rule, Henry would have to secure a papal dispensation to marry his older brother's wife. You see, Arthur was the eldest son and Henry's older brother, and it was Arthur who was supposed to inherit the throne after Henry VII. And thus, he had been married to Catherine of Aragon, the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain. You see, Spain was a superpower at the time, while England most definitely was not. So securing an alliance with the royal house of Spain would increase the power of England against external threats, while also holding at bay those within England who might wish to see the Tudor dynasty fail. But Arthur's early death threatened to undo that stability. Thus, Henry needed that alliance with Spain, but in order to get it, he needed to marry Catherine, his brother's widow. But that, of course, looks like incest. Now, since she had testified that her marriage to Arthur had never been sexually consummated, a papal dispensation was granted to secure the alliance between the two countries, Spain and England. Now, all Henry needed to secure the dynastic succession was a son. But over the years, Catherine failed to provide him with a son, and as time went on, he would become increasingly agitated about the future of the dynasty. Though Catherine did bear a daughter, Mary, it was not within Henry's power to conceive that a woman might be capable of ruling a dynasty. In his mind, the need for a son became an obsession, and his obsession would become so great, it would cause him to take matters into his own hands. He sent emissaries to Pope Clement VII asking for an annulment from Catherine on the grounds that the original dispensation that had allowed him to marry her in the first place had been granted under false pretenses. You see, he argued that Catherine and Arthur had indeed consummated their marriage, and her inability to provide Henry with a son was proof of God's judgment of their sinful union. They obviously didn't know about X and Y chromosomes back then. Catherine, of course, denied these accusations to her dying day. And Henry's strategy for securing a papal annulment was doomed to fail anyway, and for two very important reasons. From a theological point of view, to grant Henry's request for an annulment would be to reverse a previous papal judgment, which, in effect, would be admitting that the original dispensation had been wrong. Now, given the turmoil caused by the Protestants on the continent, the papacy was in no mood to add fuel to the fire. There would be no admission of papal fallibility in the current circumstances. Secondly, from a political point of view, the Pope had no interest in alienating the Spanish court. Again, Spain was a superpower and was a staunch supporter of the papacy. For all its orthodoxy, England just didn't have the economic, military, or political power that Spain did. So, if the Pope was going to have to choose between England and Spain, it was a no-brainer. Henry would just have to make do with a daughter. But Henry was not the sort of person to take no for an answer. By this time, he was already romantically involved with Anne Boleyn, the sister of his former lover, Mary Boleyn. You see, he had convinced himself, no doubt with a good deal of encouragement from Anne, that if they could just marry, she would be able to provide him with the son that he so desperately needed. Now, to make a long story short, Henry and Anne hatched a plot to have him declared head of the church in England, which would give him the power to install the Archbishop of Canterbury. With an archbishop in place who owed allegiance to the king instead of the Pope, Henry would finally be able to get his annulment from Catherine. And it was the Act of Supremacy of 1534 which would finally make Henry Tudor the first supreme head of the church in England and set the stage for Protestantism in the island nation. Now, all these political intrigues didn't resolve Henry's need for a son, however. And when Anne's first child turned out to be a girl, it wasn't long until she, too, would become expendable. For the good of the realm, to be sure. Now, Henry's third wife, Jane Seymour, finally provided him with a son, but she died in childbirth. Her son would have gone on to become Edward VI after Henry, but unfortunately he died at the age of 15, plunging the kingdom into the very chaos Henry had worked so hard to try to prevent. Mary Tudor, Henry's oldest daughter by Catherine, had been raised a Catholic and had a deep hatred of the Protestant movement which she associated with the removal of her mother as queen. So when she finally came to the throne in 1553, following the death of her half-brother Edward, she would reverse the Act of Supremacy and all policies favorable to Protestantism in England, thereby resubmitting the English crown to papal authority. She also embarked on a 5-year campaign to purge the land of what she called the Protestant heresy, for which, upon her death in 1558, she would forever be known as Bloody Mary. Following Mary's death, Henry's second child, Elizabeth, her daughter by Anne Boleyn, would succeed to the throne. Now, she had been raised a Protestant, like her mother, and when she came to power, she would reverse Mary's program of re-Romanization and again make Protestantism the national religion. It was under Elizabeth's rule that the Protestant faith would be permanently established in England. The Act of Uniformity of 1558 would create a common prayer book and an English liturgy, and a year later, she would have the Second Act of Supremacy passed by Parliament, making her the supreme governor of the Church in England. It was Elizabeth's steadfast commitment to the Anglican Church, as it came to be known, together with her stable and prosperous 40-year reign, that would solidify Anglican Protestantism as one of the major branches of the Protestant movement, along with Lutheranism and the Reformed Church, with all of its evangelical descendants. Also, because of Elizabeth's political acumen, along with a bit of good luck, she would guide England to superpower status in Europe and establish colonies not only in North America, but all across the globe. This had two very important effects. First, it demonstrated that women were just as capable as men when it came to ruling. And second, it would spread the Anglican faith worldwide. Wherever the British Empire were to spread, it would plant the Anglican Church, which is why the Anglican Communion, a European national religious movement, is found on almost every continent of the world today. Now, this map shows the distribution of religion in Europe at the beginning of the modern period, the period of Descartes, Hobbes, and John Locke. Catholicism, you can see in light pink, dominated Central and Southern Europe, while the Protestant movements were firmly in control in Northern Europe. To some degree, this division between a Protestant North and Catholic South survives today in Europe. Before we leave the Theological Revolution, we should point out that the Church, or now more appropriately labeled Catholic Church, did respond to the calls for reform, though not in a way that was satisfactory to the Protestants. The Counter-Reformation, as it is called, began with the Church Council held in Trento, Italy in 1545. Known as the Council of Trent, this gathering of the leading bishops and scholars of the Catholic community would gather off and on for nearly 20 years to debate the issues surrounding the fragmentation of European Christianity and the appropriate response to the chaos that would ensue. Of course, the Catholics would not give in on any of the major criticisms raised by Protestants, but they did seek to curb some of the abuses of ecclesiastical power and the corrupting influence of church-state relations. But in the end, the Council of Trent would reaffirm the authority of the Bishop of Rome as the sole representative of Christ on earth, the role of the Church in the mediation of divine grace through the seven sacraments, and the use of Latin as the official language of the Mass. It also confirmed the cult of the saints and veneration of icons and relics as appropriate forms of Christian worship. But the Counter-Reformation would go far beyond these strictly theological matters in its attempt to respond to what it saw as the heresy of Protestantism. There was, for example, the establishment of new religious orders, who were dedicated to good works and education for those who aspired to the priesthood. There was also a realignment of existing religious orders to emphasize the spiritual life, as opposed to the political and economic activities that dominated many of the religious orders during the Middle Ages. There was also, perhaps in direct response to the rational or intellectual approach to theology which dominated Lutheranism and the Reformed movements, an emphasis upon the mystery of the Christian religion. The Mass, which was the central liturgical activity of the Catholic Church, centered on the sacrament of the Eucharist. It was held as the core mystery of God's divine plan. The doctrine of transubstantiation, that held that the bread and wine of the Eucharistic meal was in fact transformed through the mystery of the Mass into the actual body and blood of Jesus, would become the central focus of difference between Catholic and Protestant expressions of Christianity in Europe. But there was also the rise of the great Catholic mystics like Ignatius of Loyola, Teresa of Avila, and St. John of the Cross, who emphasized a direct, personal, and mystical experience with God achieved through intensive religious exercise and spiritual discipline. But perhaps the most enduring achievement of the Counter-Reformation was the development of new forms of art that had become known as the Baroque period. Both in music and in the visual arts, the Catholic Church approved and patronized the development of new art forms that could be used as aids in teaching the doctrines of the Church to the poor and illiterate. It was also a nod to the Protestant claim that the medieval Mass was too abstract and boring for the average Christian. Now, one could experience artistic expressions that had previously been the reserve of the aristocracy. Despite all these changes, however, the Protestants would not be tempted to return to the Catholic Church, and the fragmentation of Christianity would only intensify over the centuries to come, with more innovations and new sects, which we today call denominations. Now let's take a few moments and recap what we've discovered in this lecture series. The Renaissance is a period of radical social and intellectual change, where everything Europeans thought they knew about the world, from common sense to divinely revealed truth, came under direct and relentless scrutiny. The medieval church taught us that we were the center of God's attention, and the entire universe existed as a stage upon which the divine plan of salvation was to be played out. The omnibenevolent creator of the universe had put the world before us, designed to fulfill his eternal plan of mercy. Then came the Black Death of 1346, and saints died alongside sinners, the rich with the poor, the mighty alongside the powerless, There seemed to be no possible reason, no possible end that could justify such blindly distributed suffering and death. Surviving the horrors of the Black Death certainly brought some benefits, but one could hardly think themselves saved by divine intervention. It was a mystery, plain and simple. And for those who survived it, it was time to rebuild. And with their newfound wealth, that's just what they started to do. Live for today, and to forget the horrors of the past. There would be three major intellectual revolutions that would all play out during the Renaissance. First was the astronomical or scientific revolution, where we saw a shift from a geocentric or Earth-centered understanding of the universe to the heliocentric model, put forward first by Copernicus. Then there was the geographical revolution, which led to a rejection of theocentric geography, and also led to the birth of colonialism. Finally, we looked at the theological revolution, and we saw how the Latin or Roman Church, which had survived the collapse of the Roman Empire, would succumb to the skepticism of the period through the Protestant Reformation and begin a process of fragmentation that continues to this very day. Religion was to be radicalized and being appropriated as a tool not just for theological reform, but also for social reform, and this in a period when the modern nation-state was just beginning to emerge. This, of course, leads to the nationalization of religion, where distinct nation-states, like England, would begin to identify themselves as much in unique religious terms as in linguistic and ethnic terms. Some, of course, would even become skeptical of religion altogether, though it wasn't really safe to express that kind of radical doubt for a few generations to come. When we put all this together, along with the Counter-Reformation, with its emphasis upon mysticism, what we see is an understandable rise and spread of skepticism. The belief that certain knowledge was at best improbable and at worst impossible. It would fall to the thinkers of the early modern period known as the Enlightenment to respond to this age of radical doubt. Thinkers like Rene Descartes, Thomas Hobbes, and John Locke, just to name a few, would be forced to create new intellectual frameworks in which knowledge would again become possible. The Renaissance had ended the medieval world view forever. It would be up to the modern age to create something entirely new.